Welcome, curious minds. Today, we're embarking on quite a deep dive into some of the most intricate and I'd say impactful forces shaping our world right now.
hmm
We've brought together a really fascinating collection of sources. I mean, everything from strategic outlooks by top consulting firms like EY to incredibly detailed analyses from leading think tanks, the Atlantic Council, RAND.
Right, some heavy hitters there.
Exactly. Our mission, as always, is to try and cut through the noise, providing you with a clear, hopefully incredibly insightful understanding of the forces at play.
Yeah.
We'll be zeroing in on Iran's evolving role on the global stage, dissecting the future of warfare itself, which is, wow, quite a topic,
Definitely.
and uncovering the surprising trends that are poised to define 2025 and well beyond that, too.
hmm
Think of this as your shortcut to truly being well-informed, kind of equipped with the knowledge to understand the why behind the headlines. Like, let's unpack this.
Indeed. And the sources, they really paint a comprehensive, and I have to say, at times, quite a sobering picture.
Sobering is a good word for it.
Yeah. They really highlight not just the immediate flashpoints, like the escalating tensions we've seen between Israel and Iran. That's obviously front and center.
Right.
But also the deeper, quieter, long-term shifts. We're talking about demographics, economics, technology, even our environment, all subtly yet powerfully redrawing the global map.
It's amazing how they all connect.
Exactly. What's particularly fascinating here is how interconnected these seemingly disparate elements truly are. They don't operate in silos, they interact in ways that create entirely new challenges and, well, opportunities too.
Okay, so before we zoom in on any specific hotspots, maybe let's set the broader stage. Our sources essentially give us a kind of geopolitical weather forecast for 2025.
A forecast, yeah.
And it starts with something fundamental, often overlooked, I think, people. Or more specifically, the changing demographics of people across the planet.
That's right. It's a huge underlying factor. Many developed markets, for instance, are grappling with rapidly aging populations.
We hear about this a lot, but what are the real implications?
Well, it isn't just about a few more retirees. The sheer scale of it is leading to significantly shrinking workforces.
Right. Fewer people working.
Exactly. And think about the immense strain this places on public finances. You've got fewer taxpayers supporting a growing demand for social services, like healthcare and pensions. So this demographic shift isn't just a domestic issue. It fundamentally impacts a nation's ability to innovate, to grow its economy, and ultimately its global competitiveness. It's a quiet but really profound transformation.
And what's interesting is the contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because other parts of the world have the opposite issue.
Exactly. In stark contrast, you have many emerging markets experiencing what's often called a youth bulge, a massive proportion of young people entering the workforce.
It sounds like a good thing, potentially.
It can be a tremendous asset, yes. It offers immense potential for economic growth and dynamism if, and this is the big if there are sufficient job opportunities for these new entrants.
Ah, okay, so if the jobs aren't there.
Precisely. Without those opportunities, the risk of social unrest, political instability, and even cross-border migration skyrockets. The sources highlight that in 2023 alone, the OECD reported a record 6.5 million new immigrants.
Wow, 6.5 million.
Yeah, and this makes immigration a deeply polarizing issue in many host countries, and you can see how it ties directly back to those internal demographic and economic pressures in the sending countries.
It really raises a question, doesn't it? How do these internal demographic pressures influence what countries do externally?
That's exactly the question. Do governments facing domestic unrest become more isolationist, or perhaps more prone to international adventurism, maybe to distract their populace? It's a dynamic that can lead to really unpredictable outcomes, and certainly shapes foreign policy in ways we might not immediately expect.
That's a huge underlying pressure cooker, as you said, shaping so much else we're seeing. Now, shifting gears a bit to economics, our sources point to something they call connector economies. This is a really interesting concept, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's quite insightful. These are essentially emerging markets that are actively and deliberately seeking to maintain robust trade and investment flows with all major global economies.
All of them. So not picking sides.
Exactly. We're talking about China, the EU, the US. They're strategically positioning themselves as critical hubs, sort of fiercely vying for private investment from every corner of the globe.
So this isn't just about diversification. It sounds like something bigger, like it could erode the whole idea of blocks as we know them.
That's a really good point. It forces major powers to rethink their entire engagement strategy. It could certainly lead to more transactional relationships.
And what does that mean for long-term stability? More transactions, less stable alliances?
Potentially. It's fundamentally a hedging strategy, right? Avoiding over-reliance on any single major power. Look at India, for example. They'll likely continue their production-linked incentive scheme, which is designed to boost domestic manufacturing across 13 key sectors.
No.
And Mexico, under its new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is really emphasizing nearshoring, leveraging its preferential access to the huge U.S. market.
Makes sense geographically.
Absolutely. And the latest EY CEO Outlook Pulse actually ranks Mexico fourth globally and first among these so-called connector economies as a capital investment destination for the next year.
That's significant.
It is. This whole approach fundamentally changes traditional alliance dynamics. It offers new avenues for trade and investment that could bypass historical blocks and create a more diversified, maybe more fragmented, and perhaps less predictable global economic landscape.
Okay, so from physical trade routes, let's pivot to the digital realm. Our sources highlight a powerful new concept, digital sovereignty. Could you break that down? It sounds like controlling your own digital borders.
That's a great analogy. Think of it like a nation's desire to control its own digital data, its networks, even the tools and software it uses, without foreign dependence, especially on hardware or software from rivals.
And why is this becoming such a big deal right now?
The main driver is the rapid adoption of artificial intelligence, AI. This has dramatically accelerated the strategic importance of semiconductors, the foundational chips powering everything digital.
The chips are key.
Absolutely. And the vast amounts of data AI processes and the network infrastructure that carries it all. So in 2025, we're going to see governments implementing even more policies and regulations specifically designed to control their digital spaces and, crucially, to de-risk from geopolitical rivals.
De-risk, that's the key word.
Yeah. And this isn't purely economic competition anymore. It's deeply tied to national security and, frankly, internal control as well.
And we're seeing tangible evidence of this kind of control already, aren't we? Like internet shutdowns.
Absolutely. We're already seeing this in the increasing trend of intentional internet shutdowns.
Yeah.
Governments often view this as a means of safeguarding domestic stability, rightly or wrongly. These occurred in 39 countries in 2023, which is up significantly from just 28 5 years prior. They happen particularly in conflict zones or during times of political strife, like elections or mass protests. It's a stark demonstration of how controlling network infrastructure is now seen as embedded in national security strategies.
And it goes beyond just shutting things down, right? There's the supply chain aspect, too.
Definitely. Western countries are keenly assessing geopolitical risks within their technology supply chains, especially to meet national security requirements in public procurement. What this means for business executives is that having a really detailed understanding of their data and technology value chains is no longer optional.
It's essential.
It's crucial for adapting their supply chain strategy to potential disruptions or cost increases. But, it's not all about risk. There are also significant investment opportunities being created by this push for digital independence.
Okay, how so?
Well, governments are actively incentivizing local research and development, R&D, and production in critical areas like AI algorithms, semiconductors, and network infrastructure.
Through subsidies and things like that.
Exactly, through a mix of fiscal incentives, targeted subsidies, and even state-guaranteed investments. Private equity firms, for instance, are very active in onshoring sensitive industries like semiconductors and building out digital infrastructure, especially given AI's truly massive electricity demands.
That power demand is incredible.
It is. And it's no coincidence that Figure 6 in our sources indicates that all leading markets for data centers and semiconductor production also have strong data protection laws. This really highlights how inextricably linked economic policy and geopolitical strategy have become in the digital age.
And speaking of strategic shifts, let's talk about the green revolution. Our sources say it's not just about climate change anymore. It's fundamentally about power. Clean energy investments have surged by, an incredible 40% in recent years.
That's right. And this isn't purely altruistic climate policy. It's increasingly driven by a complex interplay of economic competitiveness, geopolitical considerations, and price stability.
It's a strategic advantage through green tech.
Absolutely. We'll see this in sharp focus next year as nearly 200 countries revise their climate strategies under the Paris Agreement. This whole energy transition is fundamentally reshaping global power dynamics.
How is that playing out?
Well, look at the numbers. Annual renewable energy generation has averaged 6.2% growth in the past 5 years. Compare that to only 1.2% for non-renewables.
Big difference.
Huge. And this rapid shift has elevated geopolitics to the third highest risk for mining and metals companies. That highlights the new forms of resource competition, especially for critical minerals needed for batteries, turbines, etc. Government policies will continue to significantly shift these geoenergy dynamics in 2025.
And while we see this rapid expansion of clean technologies like EVs, electric vehicles, driven by policies and market forces.
With China way out in front on EV sales share, as Figure 7 shows.
Right. But the traditional oil and gas sector isn't just disappearing overnight, is it?
Not at all. Despite the energy transition potentially reducing consumption in the medium to long term, these new geoenergy dynamics will likely continue to support robust demand for oil and gas in 2025.
Interesting. Why is that?
Well, partly because the transition itself requires energy, and also specialized chemicals and materials derived from fossil fuels are essential for building renewable energy technologies. Plus, we're seeing trends within the oil and gas sector itself.
Like what?
Like a strong push to prioritize shareholder returns and M&A over massive new capital expenditure on exploration. And you see national oil companies diversifying into emerging markets to secure long-term demand for their products.
So the green transition is actually creating entirely new forms of resource competition and strategic dependencies,
Right.
particularly around those critical minerals and manufacturing capabilities.
Precisely. It's a whole new energy chessboard with new pieces and new rules.
Okay. And finally, under this expansive big picture, we have the evolving landscape of global alliances and trade. What's happening there?
Well, we're seeing the continued institutionalization of alternative groups led by emerging markets. This is gathering pace. The BRICS summit, for example, which Brazil will chair in 2025.
BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the new members.
Exactly, now expanded. They'll likely promote the use of local currencies in cross-border trade and investment. They might even try to advance the BRICS pay system as an alternative to existing platforms.
An alternative financial system, potentially.
Potentially, yes. And it will also foster partnerships in strategic sectors like energy, agriculture, and infrastructure among members. And we're seeing other regional initiatives too, like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation with its Beijing Action Plan for 2025-27, aiming to further facilitate economic connections among emerging markets.
And China's role in all this seems crucial. Their trade influence is growing.
Undeniably. Figure 9, using IMF data, clearly shows that China's share of trade has increased across all emerging market regions. At the same time, the shares of the US and EU are actually declining.
That's a significant rebalancing of economic power.
It is, and it has major implications for global influence. Alongside this, we have a very dynamic, very complex sanctions environment.
Sanctions. Always a factor.
Always. For instance, the longer the war in Ukraine persists, the more likely the US, EU, and others are to impose secondary sanctions on countries and companies supporting Russia's war efforts.
Which pulls other countries into the conflict indirectly.
Right. Similarly, we could see strengthening enforcement of current sanctions on Iran, or perhaps new ones being imposed depending on their actions. This creates new operational, financial, and reputational challenges for companies worldwide. Compliance teams need to be incredibly robust and vigilant.
So this reconfigured landscape maybe means traditional tools like sanctions might become less effective over time.
That's a real possibility. If alternative systems develop or coordination phrase, it could push major powers towards other forms of coercion.
Which brings us perhaps
Upwards.
to space.
Exactly. Let's look up. Space is truly becoming the next contested domain. It's transforming rapidly from a purely scientific endeavor into a major economic and geopolitical arena.
The numbers are staggering, aren't they?
They really are. The number of countries with satellites in orbit has more than doubled from 46 in 2000 to almost 100 in 2023. And the space economy itself is projected to exceed US $1.8 trillion by 2035.
1.8 trillion.
Growing at nearly twice the rate of global GDP over the next decade. It's phenomenal growth.
And that completely reshapes how we need to think about national security, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The increasing affordability of launch capabilities is fueling an explosion of space-based applications. These are becoming crucial for life on Earth, critical infrastructure, transportation, financial networks, military communications, intelligence.
Everything relies on it.
Increasingly, yes. So in 2025, this multipolar space race will reach new heights as countries compete fiercely for technological capabilities and, interestingly, resource claims. Think asteroid mining, lunar bases.
Resource claims in space.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's coming. And this also means growing cybersecurity risks to communications and critical infrastructure. We've already seen anti-satellite activities employed in the war in Ukraine.
Disrupting GPS communication.
Exactly. With estimates of nearly 25,000 satellites by 2030, the susceptibility to disruption of data in space and its transmission back to Earth is only going to grow. It's a sobering thought when you consider modern military capabilities are so heavily reliant on space.
Like the UK figure, almost 90%.
Yeah, almost 90% of UK military capabilities depend on space, according to King's College London. This domain isn't just for astronomers anymore, it's absolutely central to global power and conflict.
Okay, having set that global stage, it's clear these broader shifts are playing out intensely in specific regions. And nowhere, perhaps, is that more apparent or more volatile than in the Middle East, particularly with Iran. To really understand their actions, our sources suggest we need to go beyond the daily headlines and grasp their core worldview. What does that historical lens reveal about how they see the world, and importantly, their place in it?
That's a crucial starting point, absolutely. Iran's core doctrine, the way the regime presents itself, is deeply rooted in a narrative of victimhood and anti-imperialism.
Victimhood. How so?
Well, the regime casts itself as a victim of U.S. machinations, specifically pointing back to the 1953 CIA-backed coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mossadegh and empowered the Shah.
Right, that's a key event in their narrative.
A pivotal event. They view the U.S. as the Great Satan because of this historical interference, but also because of prolonged U.S. support for the Shah's regime, which, ironically, attempted to modernize and secularize the country, even granting freedoms to women and what Tehran perceives as continued American imperial hubris.
So this history fuels their current stance.
Deeply. It fuels their profound desire to be seen as a major international player, and it's intricately linked to their preoccupation with regime survival, which, in turn, drives an expansionist impulse beyond their borders.
An expansionist impulse?
Yes. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself articulated this as Iran's historical, geographical, and regional duty, essentially asserting dominance over the Persian Gulf and much of the Gulf of Oman. This historical lens is crucial. It's not just about current events, it's a deep-seated narrative that drives their behavior.
Which makes negotiating incredibly difficult, I imagine.
Extremely. As highlighted by one source's observation that the Islamic Republic will never fall in line with international norms, that perspective shapes everything.
That's a powerful context. Now, what about Iran's nuclear ambitions? This has been this pressing challenge for years, always seemingly on the brink. What do our sources say about their current capabilities and intentions?
Indeed, it's the perennial worry. Since breaching the JCPOA, the nuclear deal limits back in 2019 following the U.S. withdrawal, Iran has significantly expanded its nuclear program.
Expanded how?
They've invested heavily in new, more proliferation-sensitive activities, enriching uranium to higher levels, using more advanced centrifuges. Now, while the available evidence doesn't definitively indicate a decision to actually build a bomb,
They haven't crossed that threshold yet, as far as we know.
as far as public evidence suggests, yes. But these advances, combined with drastically reduced IAEA monitoring, give Tehran the very real option to move quickly to nuclear weapons if they choose to.
And the monitoring gaps are a major concern.
They're particularly concerning, yes. In February 2021, Iran suspended the more intrusive additional protocol. That protocol had provided the IAEA with much more information and daily access to enrichment facilities.
As that access is gone.
Largely suspended, yes. This significantly increases the risk of a breakout, a dash to weaponization happening between agency inspections. The IAEA assessed in 2023 that its continuity of knowledge regarding the program is effectively lost.
Lost. That sounds serious.
It means it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to reconstruct an accurate history of their nuclear activities during that gap. And this also raises serious concerns about potential undeclared facilities we don't even know about.
So effectively, the world is flying somewhat blind on significant parts of their program. That's terrifying. What does this mean for U.S. strategy? Are they still aiming for a return to the JCPOA?
The U.S. strategy has definitely shifted. Efforts to return to the JCPOA are now widely considered a dead end by many analysts, both inside and outside government.
A dead end. So what's the alternative?
The thinking now is that both Iran's nuclear program and its regional malign influence, its support for proxies, missile program, etc., must be viewed as equal priorities and addressed simultaneously. You can't separate them anymore.
Treat them as link problems.
Exactly. The U.S. has even privately warned Iran over suspicious nuclear activities recently, and the sources point out something critical. Even if you could get back to JCPOA-like restrictions, Iran's gained knowledge from operating advanced machines and enriching near weapons-grade uranium would allow it to ratchet up its program much more quickly if a new deal were ever struck or collapsed.
So the breakout time is permanently shorter now, regardless.
That's the implication. It implies a fundamentally changed reality for non-proliferation efforts. Even a new agreement might not fully rewind their capabilities to where they were before. It really raises the question, what level of control is truly achievable now?
Okay, beyond nukes, Iran exerts significant influence through its network, the axis of resistance. Tell us more about these proxies and their impact. How much direct control does Tehran truly have over groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis?
It's a complex relationship. Iran arms its allies groups like Qatbrave Hezbollah and Suraya Talia al-Khorassani in Iraq, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various PMF militias in Iraq. They arm them from Iran's own inventory.
Sophisticated weapons.
Yes, sophisticated ballistic missiles. They have the largest arsenal in the region, and also their aerial and maritime unmanned systems, drones, basically. These offensive capabilities enable Iran and its proxies to target Israel, U.S. forces in the Middle East, U.S. Arab allies, and crucially, to menace the free flow of commerce in vital shipping lanes like the Red Sea.
A major disruption tool.
Absolutely. Now, the source emphasizes that this axis functions more as a loose network of interconnected components driven by common interests and a shared ideological vision, rather than a strict hierarchy with direct Iranian command and control.
So, not puppets on a string.
Not exactly. However, this distinction, while technically true, doesn't diminish Iran's leverage. The sources highlight that while Iran might disavow connections, it could likely curb, say, Houthi attacks simply by threatening to cut off weapon shipments.
Ah, so they do have levers they could pull.
They certainly seem to. This reveals the strategic leverage Iran holds, despite its claims of non-involvement, and it underscores the destructive impact these proxy activities have on local populations and regional stability.
And what are the specifics? How is the U.S. trying to counter this network in different places, like Iraq?
Well, in Iraq, for instance, direct U.S. military force against pro-Iranian militias hasn't really deterred their allegiance to Iran. So the U.S. strategy there involves encouraging the Iraqi government itself to bring the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, under regular military control.
Integrate them.
Or at least control them better, yes. And strengthen loyal organizations like Iraq's counterterrorism service. Toughening sanctions against militia leaders and the banks they use for terrorism, corruption, and embezzlement could also be impactful.
And the U.S. troop presence.
While the U.S. plans to withdraw nearly all combat troops by the end of 2026, keeping a small contingent could support the U.S. military presence next door in Syria and allow a quick response capability for Iraqi counterterrorism needs. It's a balancing act.
What about the Red Sea? The Houthi attacks have caused massive disruption. What's the strategy there?
It's a major problem. Houthi attacks on international shipping through the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait have caused, at times, a more than 50% drop in Suez Canal traffic. That's huge economically.
Despite U.S. and U.K. strikes.
Despite those retaliatory strikes, yes, Iran provides arms, training, and funding, and an Iranian ship was even identified providing targeting information to the Houthis. So the U.S. strategy involves trying to reestablish deterrence, mounting a large-scale campaign to destroy Houthi missile and drone capabilities, and targeting their leadership.
And politically?
Politically, the idea is that Houthi inclusion in any future political discussions for Yemen should be explicitly linked to them stopping the shipping attacks. Alongside that, a public relations campaign highlighting Houthi failures in governance and the humanitarian crisis within Yemen itself.
And then there's Lebanon. Deeply unstable, Hezbollah's role. What's the approach there?
Lebanon is in a profound economic collapse. The U.S. strategy, according to the sources, should be supporting French-led international efforts to help. There's a proposal to provide billions in financial support, but it's linked to Lebanon actually selecting a president, which Hezbollah has blocked since October 2022, and developing a credible economic reform plan.
So aid is conditional on political progress.
Yes. And the worry is the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF. While they're not strong enough to challenge Hezbollah militarily, they are weakening due to lack of funding. If the LAF collapses, it would further strengthen Hezbollah's dominance and by extension, Iran's influence.
It sounds like these proxies have a really destabilizing effect across the board.
The sources are very clear on this. These proxy activities, operating outside state control and pledging allegiance to Iran, warp domestic politics, exacerbate sectarian differences, worsen corruption, and weaken governments' ability to protect their people, secure their borders, and deliver needed services. It's a deeply destructive ripple effect throughout the region.
We've seen the direct conflict flare up more recently between Israel and Iran. What do our sources tell us about those specific tensions and how they've maybe shifted the dynamics?
Well, take Iran's April 13 attack on Israel. It was strategically signaled in advance, which significantly helped Israel and its allies prepare their defenses. That was quite unusual.
Signal how?
Through various channels making it clear an attack was coming, likely aiming to avoid a massive, uncontrolled escalation. And Iran's own statements, saying it considered the issue concluded even before the attack was fully over, seemed designed to minimize the risk of a wider war.
But it still happened. They still launched the missiles.
Absolutely. And crucially, Iran's decision to directly strike Israel from Iranian soil broke a long-standing taboo, a threshold that hadn't been crossed before. This was further evidenced later, in October, according to some reports, when Iran fired over 180 ballistic missiles at Israel, potentially to avenge the killing of Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. It indicates a clear shift in tactics and a willingness to escalate beyond previous norms.
So it was a deliberate choice to change the rules of engagement, signaling a new, more dangerous phase, perhaps.
Precisely. Iran's primary aim, it seems, was twofold. Deter Israel from hitting Iranian diplomatic facilities again, like the consulate in Damascus, and demonstrate the sophistication and potential lethality of Tehran's missile and drone force.
Even though many failed.
Even though many failed to launch or reach their targets, thanks in no small part to U.S., Israeli, and partner assistance, the signal was sent. It says the old ground rules are now gone, Iran won't be intimidated, but they likely also calculated that the U.S. would restrain Israel from a truly massive retaliation.
It's a dangerous game of signaling.
Extremely. A dangerous game of signaling and deterrence, where miscalculation remains a very high risk. And the assistance of allies, as shown in that April defense, plays a critical role in preventing broader escalation.
And that regional defense effort, did it reveal anything else?
Yes, the successful region-wide defense of Israel during that attack dramatically demonstrated the urgent need for an effective regional security structure. It effectively previewed the potential effectiveness of an integrated air and missile defense, or IAMD, network.
Something the U.S. has been pushing for.
Exactly. U.S. leadership in developing this kind of network with Gulf partners helps demonstrate Washington's commitment to their security, especially countering perceptions that the U.S. is leaving the Middle East. It shows the value of cooperation.
What about Iran's relationships with other major global players, beyond the immediate conflict? How does this fit into the larger geopolitical chess game? Russia, for instance.
Iran's growing ties to Russia are very significant, driven primarily by mutual security concerns and perhaps a shared anti-Western outlook. Iran has been selling thousands of suicide drones to Russia for use in the Ukraine war.
The Shahed drones.
Yes, and even helping build a drone factory in Russia. In September 2024, reports emerged that Iran began delivering ballistic missiles to Russia as well.
And what does Iran get in return?
In return, Iran is seeking to acquire advanced weaponry, things like the Su-35 aircraft, Russia's top-of-the-line S-400 air defense system. It's also probable Iran is receiving technology for internal monitoring and repression from Russia.
A worrying exchange.
Very. And the sources suggest the Putin regime might even welcome a nuclear-armed Iran, simply for the sheer distraction it would cause for the U.S. and Western countries, diverting attention and resources away from Ukraine.
That's a cynical calculation. What about Europe? The EU used to be deeply involved in the nuclear deal. That relationship seems to have soured completely.
It really has. Iran became deeply disillusioned with the EU after European efforts to protect Iran from the Trump administration's sanctions largely failed. In 2019, Supreme Leader Khamenei went so far as to call the EU irrelevant and deceitful.
Strong words.
Very. And trade reflects this. It's plummeted to a fraction of its pre-JCPOA highs. Imports into the EU from Iran in 2022 were only about 1 billion euros compared to 17 billion back in 2011.
So the EU has much less economic leverage now.
Far less. Germany remains Iran's largest EU trading partner, but it's only around 30% of that diminished total. And European stances, particularly from the E3, France, Germany, and the UK, have hardened significantly.
Why the hardening?
Multiple reasons. Iran's continued nuclear expansion, its missile sales to Russia, which was seen as crossing a real red line, and the brutal repression of the 2022 protests, including human rights violations and the detention of European and dual citizens.
So even the election of a supposed moderate didn't help.
While the election of President Masoud Pezeshkian in July 2024 briefly rekindled some hopes for engagement, his government has really struggled to maintain even a reformist appearance under the supreme leader. The UK, notably, views the conflict landscape now as a multi-front contest involving an axis of upheaval linking Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran.
An axis of upheaval. What about broader Asian engagement in the Gulf states? These seem to be pursuing their own independent paths, not necessarily following the West's lead.
That's a crucial point, yes. China's share of trade, as we mentioned, has continued to increase in all emerging market regions, including those actively engaging with Iran. This reflects a broader shift in global economic gravity towards Asia.
And the Gulf Arab states, Saudi Arabia, UAE.
Simultaneously, Gulf leaders like Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, and UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed, MBZ, are pursuing détente with Iran.
Détente. After years of hostility. Why?
Their primary motivation seems pragmatic. Reduce the threat of direct attacks on their own countries. They remember incidents like the 2019 attack on Saudi oil facilities, allegedly by Iran or its proxies, or the 2022 Houthi missile and drone attack on Abu Dhabi.
So it's about risk reduction.
Yes. This détente allows them to focus on their ambitious economic diversification plans, attracting foreign investment and transitioning away from fossil fuels. Their motivation is also influenced by a perception of reduced U.S. presence and reliability in the region since around 2013.
Perceived U.S. withdrawal.
Or at least inconsistency. They point to things like a previous U.S. administration's failure to enforce a red line in Syria, a subsequent administration's lack of retaliation for the Saudi oil attack, and the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan. All this highlights a complex, multipolar chess game where regional powers are making their own pragmatic calculations, often independent of and sometimes clearly in reaction to the perceived moves of major global powers like the U.S.
Okay, finally on Iran, let's touch on its internal state and how it projects power digitally. Our sources indicate increasing numbers of Iranians are turning against the regime. What's driving this internal disaffection?
That's right. There seems to be growing disillusionment. It stems from a confluence of factors: blatant election manipulation, a struggling economy plagued by sanctions and mismanagement, pervasive corruption, severe environmental challenges like water disputes with Afghanistan, Iraq, and Turkey, and of course, deeply repressive social policies, particularly towards women.
And this is manifesting publicly.
Yes. The 2024 presidential election, for example, saw the lowest turnout ever recorded in the Islamic Republic. And despite the regime's use of massive force to suppress the woman, life, freedom protests that erupted in 2022, defiance persists.
How does that defiance show itself?
In many ways, we're seeing daily acts of civil disobedience, like women refusing to wear the mandatory hijab in public, youth hanging banners or spraying anti-regime slogans, artists continuing to produce protest art. The defiance has become more creative, more widespread, with things like viral videos of Iranians drinking alcohol in celebration of former President Raisi's death. A counter-narrative to the regime is actively being invented and propagated within the country.
And the Iranian diaspora, people living outside Iran, they seem to be playing a more significant role than ever before in supporting this internal unrest.
They really are. The Iranian diaspora appears unprecedentedly organized. They've held large rallies in major Western cities: Berlin, London, Paris, Toronto, Washington. This level of organization suggests they will likely play a bigger role in supporting internal unrest than perhaps has been the case previously.
What are they doing?
They've actively called for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, to be designated as a foreign terrorist organization, a call that Canada, for instance, followed through on in June 2024. This external pressure complements the internal dissent, creating a kind of dual challenge for the regime in Tehran.
And the disturbing trend of hostage-taking, detaining foreigners, and dual nationals. That continues to be a tool for the regime, doesn't it? How does this fit into their broader strategy?
Indeed, sadly it does. Iran regularly detains foreign and dual nationals on what are widely seen as trumped-up charges. The purposes seem clear. Economic gain through ransom or release of frozen funds, leverage to secure the release of Iranians held abroad, and perhaps even as a form of human shield or protection against external attack.
Are there specific examples?
The sources cite examples like the 2016 release of 5 Americans for approximately $1.7 billion in frozen funds and settled claims, and the 2023 release of 5 Iranian Americans in exchange for unfreezing $6 billion in Iranian oil revenue held in South Korea, restricted for humanitarian use.
So it works for them, in a way. How can this be countered?
Well, the source suggests that to truly signal the high cost of this policy, the U.S. should work closely with allies to develop a common, pre-agreed set of diplomatic and economic penalties that are automatically triggered by any new hostage-taking incidents.
Like what kind of penalties?
Things like immediately declaring specific Iranian diplomats persona non grata, imposing targeted sanctions, restricting travel. The idea is to create a unified, predictable, and costly response that makes the practice far less attractive for Tehran.
Okay. Beyond the physical realm, Iran's digital projection of power is also quite sophisticated. How are they leveraging cyber capabilities both internally and externally?
It's a sophisticated blend, yes. Internally, Iran uses cyber espionage extensively to suppress domestic dissent. They target expatriate communities abroad, trying to monitor and intimidate them, which has prompted warnings from Western intelligence services.
And externally.
Externally, these activities are used for political, military, and economic espionage. They target foreign ministries, armed services, government organizations linked to trade and finance, the defense industrial base of rivals, and have even targeted U.S. presidential campaigns in the past.
Who directs these operations?
These operations appear to be directed by Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security, MOSS, and elements within the IRGC, often supported by a network of quasi-private contractors. Furthermore, Tehran actively restricts access to global information and communications technologies for its own population. They attempt to create a separate national internet, a sort of walled garden online.
The halal internet.
Exactly. And the regime frequently disconnects the country from the global internet entirely during critical periods, like mass protests or following former President Raisi's death in May 2024. They're demonstrating new techniques to limit international reporting on these outages, too. So this sophisticated blend of internal repression, external influence operations, and digital control really paints a picture of a regime deeply focused on its own survival and the projection of power, using both traditional and increasingly novel digital means.
So with this incredibly complex, shifting geopolitical landscape, what does the future of warfare actually look like? Our sources delve into this in detail, and it's really not just about bigger bombs or faster jets, is it? It seems more about fundamental shifts in how and where conflicts might even occur. This really forced me to rethink some basic assumptions.
Me too.
What are the key lessons from military history that might prepare us or perhaps warn us about what's coming down the track?
Well, the past provides some crucial and often humbling lessons here, lessons that are frequently ignored, sometimes at great peril. Military history, as one source puts it, is littered with mistaken predictions about the future of warfare.
Like what kind of mistakes?
Think about the pervasive expectation of a brief storm before World War I. A quick, decisive war turned out very differently. Or France's rigid reliance on the Maginot Line, designed for static trench warfare right before World War II, completely misjudging the impact of mobile armored warfare, the Blitzkrieg.
Underestimating the new technology and tactics.
Exactly. Or even the U.S. focus on conventional, large-scale, state-on-state war before the very different asymmetrical conflicts of Vietnam. These examples just underscore the immense challenge of accurate forecasting. They imply a constant need for adaptation, for intellectual flexibility, and avoiding rigid assumptions about how future conflicts will unfold.
And how does this apply to the U.S. specifically? The Rand report had some stark warnings.
It did. The report suggests that by 2030, the U.S. will confront deepening strategic dilemmas in maintaining its position as the world's only truly global military superpower. Its main adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and various terrorist groups, will likely remain constant threats.
But alliances might change.
That's a key point. U.S. allies are liable to change. Europe, as we discussed, could become more fragmented and inward-looking. Asia is reacting to China's rise in complex and unpredictable ways. This means future conflicts might occur in locations most dangerous or inconvenient for U.S. interests, requiring a really diverse set of capabilities, precisely as U.S. quantitative and potentially qualitative military advantages diminish relative to competitors like China.
So the U.S. might lose its ability to dictate terms.
In essence, the report warns the U.S. could progressively lose the capacity to dictate strategic outcomes and shape when, where, and why wars occur. That's a profound potential shift.
So with those sobering lessons in mind, what are the key global geopolitical trends that are actively shaping this future of conflict? What are the big drivers?
Several overarching trends are critical here. First, China's relentless pursuit of Indo-Pacific regional hegemony continues. This is driven partly by economics, but also by a deep historical narrative aiming to reverse its perceived century of humiliation and reassert its historical influence.
And how are neighbors reacting?
That's the second trend. Other states in Asia are actively reassessing their positions in reaction to China's growing ambitions. They're weighing whether to bandwagon with China or try to balance against Beijing. This could lead to new U.S. partners, perhaps closer ties with Vietnam or India, but potentially fewer reliable allies elsewhere, maybe like the Philippines, depending on their internal politics. And importantly, this dynamic suggests a greater likelihood of maritime conflicts, particularly in contested waters like the South China Sea.
Okay. Trend 3.
Third, revanchist Russia. Despite arguably being a declining power in some long-term economic and demographic respects, Russia, under Putin, is growing more aggressive externally. We've seen interventions in Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, Syria, all aimed at reaffirming its great power status and sphere of influence.
And Europe. You mentioned fragmentation earlier.
Yeah.
How does that play into conflict?
That's the fourth trend. Upheaval, or at least significant change, in Europe. The European Union appears to be becoming more fractured internally, less interested in expeditionary operations far beyond its borders, and increasingly inward-looking.
Why inward-looking?
Mired in challenges like managing immigration, the growth of right-wing populism in several member states, and the lingering economic effects of the euro crisis, and now energy costs. While NATO, the military alliance, might actually grow stronger as an entity in response to Russia.
Finland and Sweden joining.
Exactly. But its activities will likely be directed more toward preserving security within Europe itself and less towards those broader expeditionary operations further afield. This might mean countries like Poland and other Eastern European nations, feeling more directly threatened by Russia, become increasingly willing to join U.S.-led coalitions or alliances abroad, while traditional Western European allies like France or Germany might become more hesitant to commit significant resources far from home.
A potential split in NATO's focus, then. And the Middle East. Still a source of conflict.
Absolutely, that's the fifth trend. Persistent turmoil in the Islamic world. Despite decades of counterterrorism efforts, the Middle East remains afflicted with Islamic jihadist terrorism, systemic poor governance in many states, deep economic issues, and those growing tensions we discussed between Iran and Saudi Arabia and between Iran and Israel.
Shaping conflicts like Syria and Yemen.
Exactly. These factors continue to shape ongoing conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and beyond, with no clear resolution expected soon. The Middle East, the sources argue, arguably remains the most likely location for the United States to be involved in an overt, kinetic conflict between now and 2030.
And you stress these trends are interconnected.
Critically interconnected. For example, European fragmentation and distraction can create openings for Russian influence or adventurism. The Middle East's instability fuels global terrorism networks, which can require continued U.S. counterterrorism presence, even as the U.S. tries to pivot its strategic focus elsewhere, like towards Asia. It's a complex web.
How are adversaries adapting their tactics and capabilities? It sounds like it's not just about matching the U.S. tank for tank, plane for plane anymore.
That's a crucial distinction, yes. Adversaries are evolving significantly in how they approach conflict. China and Russia continue to modernize and professionalize their conventional militaries, actively closing the qualitative gap with the U.S. in many areas.
But what about others, like Iran or North Korea?
Right. Then you have these second-tier powers. Knowing they cannot militarily match the U.S. conventionally across the board, they are increasingly turning to asymmetric capabilities.
Asymmetric, meaning?
Meaning capabilities that sidestep direct confrontation where the U.S. is strongest. Think cyber warfare, advanced long-range missiles, drones, and potentially weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear, to counter perceived U.S. conventional superiority. A major shift is also seen in the use of gray zone tactics.
Gray zone, what does that entail?
This is where adversaries use coercion and aggression to achieve national objectives below the threshold of conventional war. Tactics often involve using quasi-military forces like maritime militias or covert state operatives, or non-state actors like mercenaries or proxy forces.
Making it hard to attribute or respond conventionally.
Exactly. It creates ambiguity. These tactics are most effective in disputed territories, think South China Sea, eastern Ukraine before the full invasion, and in areas where state control is weak. They aim to achieve strategic gains incrementally without provoking a full-scale military response.
And technology is enabling this.
Yes, thanks to rapid changes in military and communications technology, there's a weakening of the state's traditional monopoly on violence. Non-state actors, or proxy forces in these gray zone conflicts, can destabilize states with increasing ease and effectiveness.
What about truly disruptive technologies, like AI?
New military technology, most notably AI, is definitely on the horizon and could fundamentally upset today's military balances. Particularly concerning is the potential advent of lethal autonomous weapons systems, LAW-WS weapons that could select and engage targets without direct human intervention. That raises huge ethical and strategic questions.
And cyber. That seems central now.
Absolutely central. Cyber operations play an increasingly vital role in modern warfare and even in pre-conflict shaping operations. Control of the cyber domain is becoming essential for domestic stability, too. Look at China tightly monitoring online content, using cyber surveillance for behavior control. All states are concerned about preventing the use of the cyber domain for foreign subversion or influence campaigns.
And for espionage and sabotage.
Yes. As more and more sensitive data is digitized and stored in the cloud, government, corporate, personal data, the cyber domain inevitably becomes the primary target for espionage efforts. Beyond spying, cyber sabotage could play an increasingly important role in actual warfare by 2030.
Sabotaging infrastructure.
Exactly. Power grids, financial systems, communication networks, transport systems. The number of countries confirmed to have offensive cyber capabilities grew from just a handful back in 2007 to more than 30 by 2017, and it's certainly higher now. And crucially, for the U.S., much of its critical infrastructure lies outside direct Department of Defense or U.S. government control. It's privately owned,
Making it an easier target.
posing a comparatively easier target for adversaries to attack through cyber means. That's a major vulnerability in this new era of pervasive cyber conflict.
Beyond direct military might and cyber attacks, our sources really emphasize how broader economic and environmental factors are shaping future conflicts. This feels like the truly deep dive element, connecting dots that are often overlooked.
Absolutely. These are powerful undercurrents. Global economic trends, for instance, play a significant, if sometimes indirect, role in conflict potential. Well, for one, protectionism is on the rise globally. While greater trade and economic interdependence are generally correlated with less war between major powers, we've seen a surge in trade restrictions. Over 15,000 trade-related interventions, most of them restraints like tariffs or quotas, occurred just between November 2008 and early 2018, and the trend has likely continued. This can certainly create friction and reduce the economic ties that might otherwise inhibit conflict.
In China's economic expansion.
Second, China's economic ambitions continue to expand globally. Its Belt and Road Initiative, for example, extends across Eurasia, even reaching traditional U.S. allies like the UK, France, and Germany. And as Chinese economic interests grow worldwide, so too will Chinese security interests and potentially its military presence to protect those interests.
What about resources?
Yeah.
The classic cause of conflict.
Third, yes, control over and access to natural resources have long been considered a potential cause of war. This remains a consistent factor, perhaps even intensified now with the global energy transition creating new demand for specific critical minerals like lithium, cobalt, rare earths. Competition for these could become a flashpoint.
And the relative economic strength of the U.S. and its allies.
Fourth, that's changing too. While the U.S. and its allies will likely collectively remain the dominant economic force on an absolute level for the near future, their rate of growth will likely be slower than some competitors. This means they'll make up a smaller share of global GDP by 2030.
What's the implication of that?
It means the U.S. will be less able to rely on the overwhelming economic dominance it enjoyed, say, in the latter half of the 20th century, to automatically gain military advantage or fund massive defense buildups relative to rivals.
And this leads directly to a critical point you mentioned earlier about the defense industry itself. It seems to be facing its own set of challenges.
Precisely. This trend of eroding relative economic leverage will likely be exacerbated by the shrinking defense industrial base in the U.S. and many allied countries. Decades of consolidation and, in some areas, decline mean fewer companies competing, fewer choices for major weapon systems, and critically, a diminished capacity to rapidly ramp up production for a major high-intensity conflict.
Can you give an example?
Sure. In 1960, there were 11 U.S. prime contractors capable of designing and building advanced military fixed-wing aircraft. Today, there are only 3. The U.S. could find itself, the sources warn, with only one type of advanced fighter aircraft, the F-35, in active production in the near future. That reduces resilience and options.
And this affects sanctions too, the preferred tool.
Finally, yes, the power and effectiveness of U.S. economic sanctions, its preferred means of coercion short of military force, might decline over the coming decade.
Why would sanctions become less effective?
Several reasons. If other major economies, perhaps reacting to perceived overuse of sanctions by the U.S., successfully develop alternative international payment systems that bypass the U.S. dollar and SWIFT. If coordination among traditional allies on sanctions becomes more difficult due to diverging interests, and if China makes its financial sector significantly more open and accessible for non-Western transactions.
What's the bottom line if sanctions lose their punch?
It's a critical point the sources raise. The erosion of economic leverage implies that military force might become, relatively speaking, the more common or perhaps even the default option for global powers seeking to achieve their objectives. If sanctions lose their sting, what other coercive tools remain, short of war? It's a worrying prospect.
And turning to the environment. These trends are no longer just a long-term worry about polar bears, are they? Our sources confirm they are already direct drivers of instability and potential conflict today.
Yeah.
That's a stark realization.
It is indeed. Climate change is here, and it's a threat multiplier. Global air surface temperatures will likely be, on average, 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer in 2030 than they were in the late 20th century. This isn't just about feeling hotter.
What are the impacts?
It affects human health, it reduces economic productivity in agriculture and construction, and it creates real operational problems for military forces, for instance. Basing aircraft in already extremely hot regions like the Persian Gulf becomes more difficult and costly.
And water scarcity. That seems critical.
Critically important. Hotter temperatures exacerbate water scarcity. This is a huge issue, particularly in regions already prone to instability, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central and South Asia. This is leading to increased water-related conflict, both within states, interstate, and between states, interstate.
Are there current examples?
Yes. Disputes over shared water resources already exacerbate tensions between Iran and Afghanistan over the Helmand River. And the sources suggest there's potential for military conflict between Iran and Iraq over tributaries of the Tigris River and between Iran and Turkey over the Aras River as upstream damming reduces downstream flows. Water is becoming weaponized.
What about the Arctic, melting ice there?
Furthermore, yes, the opening Arctic. Melting polar ice makes the region more navigable for longer periods. This dramatically increases the chances of competition and potential spillover conflict among rival great powers, the U.S., Russia, and increasingly China, as they compete for resources, shipping routes, and strategic advantage in this new frontier.
And rising sea levels.
Finally, sea level rise will cause significant humanitarian challenges, displacing populations, and it will literally shift geography in geopolitically sensitive regions. Think about low-lying islands in the South China Sea, affecting China's disputed sovereignty claims based on those features. It also directly affects low-lying U.S. military bases like naval bases in Norfolk or Diego Garcia. These environmental pressures are absolutely not just background noise. They are direct drivers of instability and potential conflict, especially for resource-stressed regions demanding immediate strategic attention.
Okay, so we've taken this incredibly detailed journey through all these sources. We've looked at the quiet demographic shifts influencing global stability, the rise of these connector economies reshaping trade, the new digital battlegrounds, the strategic importance of green tech, and these profound changes in how and why conflicts might erupt in the future. What does this all mean for us, for the listeners, trying to make sense of this increasingly complex world? What are the big takeaways here?
That's the key question, isn't it? If we try to connect all these dots, several really important cross-cutting themes emerge from these sources. They provide a crucial framework, I think, for understanding the next few years.
Okay, what's the first theme?
First, the sources consistently point to a world where power is far more distributed. It's a clear multipolarity, but perhaps more importantly, it features increasingly fluid alliances.
Fluid alliances, meaning less reliable.
Or at least less fixed. Traditional blocs, like maybe the Cold War East-West divide, seem to be weakening. New alignments are forming, often based on pure economic pragmatism, like those connector economies playing all sides, or sometimes based on shared grievances or ideologies, like the expanded BRICS group, or Iran's Axis of Resistance network, or the growing Russia-Iran ties.
So fewer clear sides and more deal-making.
Exactly, more transactional relationships. This makes global diplomacy far more complex and, frankly, less predictable than it might have been in previous eras.
Okay, so it's not a simple two-team game anymore. It's more like a multiplayer dynamic chessboard where allegiances can shift based on the issue. What's the second big theme?
Second, we see the profound intertwining of domestic stability and international stability that can't be separated. Issues like aging populations and workforce strain in developed nations, or youth unemployment and a lack of opportunity in emerging markets, or internal dissent within Iran, or government fiscal challenges everywhere, these are not just isolated domestic matters.
How do they connect internationally?
They directly fuel social unrest at home. They drive cross-border migration pressures. And they can influence external behavior, leading either to aggression abroad as a distraction or sometimes to a more intense internal consolidation of power and repression. Domestic health directly impacts foreign policy.
Right. Third theme.
Third, there's the clear weaponization of everything. That might sound dramatic, but look at the evidence. The concept of digital sovereignty, the use of cyber operations for domestic control, espionage, sabotage it, demonstrates that technology, far beyond traditional military hardware, is now a critical battleground.
And it's not just digital.
No. Similarly, the strategic importance of semiconductors, rare earths for green tech, even control over data flows, it means that economic competition is geopolitical competition now. Trade policy is security policy. Technology standards are strategic contests.
It's like the entire global system, finance, tech, trade, information is becoming part of the strategic chessboard where almost anything can be leveraged as a tool of statecraft or coercion.
That's a very good way to put it. Fourth, flowing from that, there's a worrying erosion of traditional deterrence and maybe even international norms.
How so?
The potentially declining effectiveness of economic sanctions, as we discussed. Iran's direct strike on Israel breaking a long-held taboo against such state-to-state attacks. The proliferation of sophisticated asymmetric capabilities, drones, missiles, cyber weapons by second-tier powers. All these suggest that the old, somewhat predictable rules of engagement are being rewritten, or at least severely tested.
And those gray zone tactics fit in here too.
Perfectly. The gray zone tactics deliberately operate below the threshold of conventional war, making traditional deterrence models and responses incredibly challenging. How do you deter actions that are designed to be ambiguous, deniable, and below the level that would normally trigger a military response? It's a huge challenge.
Okay. Fifth theme.
Fifth, there's the unavoidable accelerating impact of climate change. While it's often framed as a long-term environmental problem, the sources make it clear. Climate change is already directly influencing security dynamics today.
Through resource scarcity.
Primarily, yes. Resource scarcity, particularly water stress. It's affecting basic habitability through extreme heat, making some regions harder to live and work in. And it's physically opening new contested areas, like the Arctic. All of these factors are driving immediate instability and conflict potential, especially in regions that are already fragile politically or economically, like parts of the Middle East and Africa. It's a threat multiplier.
And finally, the sources bring us back to a significant challenge for the United States, given its traditional role as a global security provider. It really sounds like it's not just about managing individual crises anymore, but understanding how these underlying pressures create a fundamentally different global operating environment.
That's it, exactly.
It's almost like the global operating system is getting a forced chaotic upgrade, and not everyone has the same patch or even agrees on the need for an upgrade.
Precisely. That's a great analogy. And the RAND report's conclusion that the U.S. could progressively lose the capacity to dictate strategic outcomes is stark. It's a warning. Shrinking defense industrial bases, shifting alliances, the diversification of adversary tactics, all these mean the U.S. must adapt its strategy profoundly. It likely needs to move beyond relying solely on overwhelming military and economic dominance, perhaps towards more networked, coalition-based approaches, and maybe prioritizing different tools.
So what's the big takeaway from connecting all these sources?
What's fascinating, I think, is how this deep dive reveals that the headlines we see every day about immediate conflicts or crises, while obviously critical and impactful, are often just symptoms of these much larger structural shifts happening underneath. Understanding the confluence of demographics, technology, economics, environment, and ideology allows us to see the strategic logic, however unsettling or even dangerous that logic might be, behind the actions of states and non-state actors alike. It forces us to confront a future that might look quite different and potentially more turbulent than the past few decades. Hashtag outro pie.
Wow. This deep dive has certainly given us, and hopefully you, a lot to consider. From those quiet, slow-burn demographic shifts influencing global stability for decades to come, to the overt missile exchanges that can reshape regional power dynamics overnight. It's clear the world is navigating some truly profound transformations.
We've explored how seemingly distant issues, things like digital sovereignty or the future of green technology, are actually deeply woven into the fabric of future conflicts. The lines between economic competition, the technological race, and military strategy are bluing faster than ever before. It creates a truly multi-domain, multifaceted global struggle for influence, for security, for prosperity.
You know, one thought that really sticks with me from synthesizing all these sources is this kind of paradox. Given the shrinking defense industrial bases in the West and the increasing reliance everywhere on asymmetric tactics like cyber or drones, are we potentially moving towards a future where the sheer cost and risk of traditional large-scale warfare becomes so prohibitive that global powers are actually forced to innovate away from kinetic conflict?
That's the optimistic take, perhaps.
Or does it simply make smaller, more localized, maybe more frequent, deniable gray zone conflicts the new perpetual norm? It's a fundamental question, I think.
Yeah.
Will these pressures ultimately deter major war or just redefine conflict into something more insidious and constant?
A crucial question with no easy answer right now.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope you feel much more informed, perhaps a little unsettled, but definitely better equipped to understand the multifaceted challenges and changes defining our shared geopolitical future. Keep observing, keep questioning. Until next time, stay curious.